Understanding poetry. I know many students roll their eyes and sigh when they think about studying poetry, but try to keep an open mind. The first step to appreciating and feeling comfortable with poetry is to basically understand a poem both literally and figuratively. Billy Collins expresses this idea of reading first for pleasure in his poem, Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with the hose to find out what it really means. Poetry should give us pleasure. How many times, for example, have you enjoyed a song on the radio? Believe it or not, that is a poem. Someone is just singing it. I don't know about you, but it takes me a while to understand a song that I hear for the first time. Then once I understand the song, I get a lot more enjoyment from it. Poetry is the same way. When you first read a poem, it will probably not mean very much to you. It takes time for a poem to sink in and become clear. One way to make a poem more understandable is to read it aloud, then read it aloud again. Poetry, like music, should be heard. Poets use a number of tools such as repetition, connotation, and figurative language in order to create an experience. So unless you read a poem aloud, often the experience is not going to be the same. Once you experience a poem, then you can start trying to understand it. Do not always assume that there is some moral or lesson connected to the poem. Often a poet just wants to pass on an experience. After you have read a poem for a few times, your next step is to try paraphrasing it. Use your own words to say what the poem says. Start by replacing the figurative language with literal meanings. Try to keep the author's verb tense and point of view, and be as plain and direct as possible. Determine who the speaker is, because it usually is not going to be the poet. What is the occasion? What is happening in the poem? What is the central purpose or theme of the poem? Let's take a look at some poets' tools up close, starting with diction, specifically denotation versus connotation. Denotation, as the textbook explains, is the actual dictionary meaning of the word, while connotation is more of what a word suggests beyond its dictionary meaning. For example, if I say to you, "My, you look rather slim today," you would take this as a compliment. However, if I said, "You look skinny," you would not necessarily think it means the same thing. In fact, if you really are skinny, you might even take it as an insult. Poets are very aware of connotation and use this to help them write poetry. A perfect example of this is My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke. In the second stanza, the word romp is important to consider. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. While the speaker's father danced around the kitchen, the word romped suggests that he was not very light on his feet. Instead, it gives us the feeling of stomping, which is not at all considered graceful dancing. When reading through poems in the future, try picking up a dictionary and looking up some of the words, even if you have an understanding of their basic meanings. It will help bring a better understanding of the poet's intent. Figures of speech are also poetic tools, and your textbook discusses these in great detail. However, here is a brief overview of a few, beginning with imagery. These are details included in a poem that relate to senses: visual, oral, tactile, olfactory, gustatory. You may be more familiar with these termed as the five senses. Besides these five senses, other senses such as internal feelings like thirst, hunger, or fatigue, or a sense of movement can also be used as imagery in a poem. To help give you an understanding of how sensory images work in a poem, let's look at Meeting at Night by Robert Browning. The gray sea and the long black land, and the yellow half-moon large and low, and the startled little waves that leap in fiery ringlets from their sleep, as they gain the cove with pushing prow and quench its speed i' the slushy sand. Then a mile of warm sea-scented beach, 3 fields to cross till a farm appears. A tap at the pane, the quick sharp scratch, and blue spurt of a lighted match, and a voice less loud through its joys and fears than the 2 hearts beating each to each. While this is obviously a love poem, notice how Browning never mentions the actual word love. Instead, he uses imagery to give a sense of what the poem is about. He shows this rather than tells this, which is one reason why imagery is such a powerful poetic tool. The sight imagery is probably the easiest to pick out. There's the gray sea and long black land. So this gives an image of being out in the sea and looking at the land, which is one long line or horizon, and black suggests that it's nighttime. Browning also uses sound imagery. He does this by using specific types of words that have sounds that also relate to the feeling of sound. There's the pushing prow, notice the use of alliteration, and the quench and slushy sand. It is possible to imagine how the lover lands on the beach in his boat and pushes the boat onto the shore, and the bottom of the boat scrapes against the sand. Of course, this is yet another reason to read poetry aloud to yourself, because you may not have noticed this oral imagery if you hadn't heard it first. Symbolism is another poetic element often used by poets. Just as with fiction and drama, a symbol is an object or action that represents something beyond itself. Poets love symbolism, as you'll especially notice when you read the poem The Sick Rose, which is a very famous poem written by William Blake, who was also a very talented book artist and illustrator. The Sick Rose. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. After you read the poem a few times, you'll probably realize there's more going on here than a worm destroying a flower. Consider some of the visual imagery. Invisible worm, bed, crimson joy, dark secret love. Then there's the auditory imagery, the howling storm. There are a few different interpretations possible, but most critics consider the rose to represent a woman and the worm to be her secret lover. The love affair is passionate, but it is not healthy. Finally, let's look at metaphor. Robert Frost described it as saying one thing and meaning another. There is an implied comparison between unlike items. The very famous poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken, is an example of a metaphorical poem, and like much of his other poetry, it is not too difficult to understand. The speaker is someone who has to make a decision about what direction his life will take, and he has 2 choices available to him, or 2 roads. It is a difficult decision because he'd like to take them both if he could, and while he tells himself that he might be able to take one later, he knows that probably won't happen. Most college students will have a special appreciation of this poem, since they have been required to decide which road in life they plan to take before selecting the academic road. This brief overview will get you started on your journey to understanding and hopefully appreciating poetry. However, there is much more information available in the class textbook. While we don't want to torture a poem or beat it with a hose, as Billy Collins describes, it is possible to take a poem apart and examine it closely, to hold it up to the light like a color slide, and the more we know, the more we can enjoy poetry.